Hey guys, welcome back to Night Dangers. Today I have the gripping story of what happened to the 12 climbers in 1967 who tried to climb Alaska's Mount McKinley, known locally as Denali. In the summer of 1967, these 12 young men planned their ultimate climb, seeking the thrill of a lifetime. Little did they know a horrifying disaster was waiting for them up on the mountain. Unfortunately, they did not make it, and so they could not return home. At least not all of them. The very few that survived told the story of what actually happened that day. All of it was recorded in Andy Hall's book called Denali's Howl. And man, it is actually a nightmare. You need to understand, guys, this is not just any mountain. You cannot just climb it. There's a lot that should be done before even considering conquering a mountain as dangerous as Denali. In fact, the Athabascan Indians who inhabit these lands always thought Denali as something majestic, yet so sinister. But still they held immense respect for the mountain and believed it was a place best left untouched due to their superstitions surrounding glacial ice. But our brave adventurers were a little crazy, reckless. They just pressed on, undeterred by the mountain's scary reputation. It all started in 1966 when Joe Wilcox, a student at Brigham Young University, had a plan to climb a huge mountain while working a summer job for the Forest Service. At first, he couldn't find anyone to join him on the journey, so he sent out a newsletter hoping to find people who would join him by paying $3,000 each for food, gear, and transportation. Eventually, a bunch of people reached out to him, and 8 of them agreed to join. Overjoyed by this news, Joe asked Mount McKinley National Park for permission to climb. However, the park officials had doubts about Joe's team's experience. After all, they were just a bunch of kids, and certainly they lacked experience in climbing. But Joe and his team finally, after a lot of trying, did convince the officials to some extent, because a ranger named Art Hayes suggested that, okay, if you really want to go and climb this mountain so bad, you have to merge with 3 other climbers who are actually very well experienced and also want to reach the summit. Joe right away agreed. He didn't care who he has to go with as long as he gets to go up to the mountain. That's all it mattered. So the 2 groups met and agreed to climb the mountain together. They were given permission to proceed with certain conditions though. They had to carry radio for communication. The 2 groups had to stick together, and the less experienced members had to take training courses that could potentially save their lives. So everyone in the team agreed to these conditions. Then once everybody was ready, eventually the expedition known as the Wilcox Expedition began, and the men embarked on their journey. They traveled on the Alaska Highway through Canada and reached Alaska, eventually reaching Denali Highway. The dirt road was over 130 miles long and led them to Ellison Visitor Center, which served as the main communication hub. After merging with the new climbers and whatnot, the group now consisted of 12 young men, including Joe, who were quite different from each other and had conflicts due to their varying levels of experience. They didn't always get along and sometimes even refused to talk to each other. However, they set aside their differences and started their unforgettable climb together on June 22, 1967. And so, their real-life nightmare that no human would ever want to be in began. The plan for the expedition was to climb the mountain multiple times. Yeah, you heard me right. You see, they would first climb to a decent altitude and set up a camp. After that, they would again climb to an even higher altitude and make another camp. Then they would descend back to the lower camp and move supplies from it to the high camp. They would do this routine multiple times. That way they thought they would be able to bring up more supplies. This approach was not the most optimal, as you can probably tell. Although it helped them get used to the thin air, it also increased the distance they had to hike. To make matters worse, it also started raining shortly after they began their climb. Their clothes and sleeping bags got soaked and the sun barely appeared long enough to dry anything. This caused issues among the group. They began arguing about various things. Remember I said they were not getting along very well with each other? The main thing that everyone was concerned about was bringing skis for mountaineering along with all the other gear they were carrying. It was a bit too much. So after a few heated arguments, they decided to lighten their load, which was actually an unwise decision. They left behind a stove, shovel handles and saws on the trail. This turned out to be a fatal mistake because these tools were essential for constructing walls and snow shelters during dangerous windstorms. It didn't occur to anyone, as there was no official guide who had the legal responsibility for their safety in the group. No one was really thinking ahead. They were all just thinking all over the place, deciding on the spot as to what to do next. At this point, they had finished about 1/4 of the climb, and that is when a loud and powerful avalanche came crashing down the side of the valley, bringing along a large heap of rocks, snow, and ice. This blocked one of their planned routes. This was basically a turning point in their journey, but one way or another they found another route which wasn't that hazardous. As they continued ascending, one of the climbers started suffering from a severe case of heartburn. He had been secretly taking 12 antacid tablets every day. However, the medicine only provided temporary relief and did not address the underlying issue. This slowed everybody down. Then another climber was constantly feeling depressed and was extremely afraid of the mountain. The sight of it alone caused him great distress. He unintentionally followed the path of a caribou in the snow and ended up in a different valley needing to be rescued. Most of the men in the group constantly suffered from acute mountain sickness, experiencing headaches and vomiting. The only way to alleviate these symptoms was to descend to lower altitudes. So in other words, everything so far has not been going well according to their plan. However, despite the discomfort and sheer difficulty, nobody was willing to give up or quit at that point. They eventually got to an altitude of 14,000 feet. The journey was only getting even harder from this point onwards. They realized that the weather is looking a little clear at least for the next 2 days, and they saw it as their opportunity to reach the summit of the mountain. Though they knew that such favorable conditions would not last long on Denali as the weather could change in the most unpredictable ways. At this point they had made the lower camp, but still they have to climb higher to set up the next camp or the high camp. But some of the men in the group decided to stay at the lower camp while the others, more specifically, 7 of the members prepared to climb higher and establish the higher camp around 18,000 feet. Each of these climbers had emergency food, personal gear, and a sleeping bag. So with that, they separated from the rest of the 5 friends who were staying at the lower camp. At the time, they didn't know, but this would be the last time the 2 groups would ever see each other. When the 7 men were just 3,000 feet away from the summit, they faced a near-death ordeal. A sudden fire broke out in the big tent they were all staying in. They were almost asleep while this happened, but fortunately they managed to wake up right away and escaped with singed eyebrows, beards, and minor burns. The tent was completely destroyed, leaving only a smoldering floor and melted zippers. This destroyed everyone's spirit. They no longer have shelter now. Their frustration turned into anger, and they urged each other to slow down and be more cautious. High camp was set up at 18,000 feet, while the lower camp remained at 15,000 feet. The risks of altitude sickness increased as they climbed higher. Although they had only traveled 16.5 miles from McGonagall Pass where they started, their overall distance covered was much greater due to multiple climbs to transport equipment and create paths between the camps. Both groups communicated with each other over the radio from the lower camp to the high camp, discussing about weather conditions and whatnot. They believed that the weather would remain favorable and it was the right time to proceed towards the summit. Now, they didn't realize that was not the case at all. The weather was actually starting to change slowly. You see, before this expedition, the Park Service did not usually provide climbers with weather reports obtained from radio stations in Anchorage. And none of the men in the expedition had been to Denali before as well, so they lacked the experience to recognize specific signs of worsening weather on the mountain. But either way, on the morning of July 15, 4 of the 7 members at the upper camp were ready to begin their ascent to the summit, while the other 3 were not feeling too well to keep climbing, so they wanted to have a bit more rest. Also, the remaining 5 that didn't join them were still waiting at the lower camp. They were just hoping for their 7 friends to reach the summit and descend back to join them at the lower camp. However, in reality, only 4 of the 7 are actually climbing now. They are the most experienced climbers in the group. Although leaving members of the team went behind Park's instructions, no one seemed to care about that. So the 4 climbers who are ascending now are struggling a lot along the way. But after some time, they finally got to the top. And so they contacted Ascent Visitor Center to inform them about their achievement. They felt a sense of victory and celebration, lighting smoke flares, taking photos and enjoying a shared Coca-Cola. This is when the winds became so strong, blowing snow heavily and reaching speeds of up to 70 miles per hour. This was the beginning of a monstrous Arctic super blizzard. The winds were starting to reach an astounding 300 miles per hour. It was about to be a massive storm. This horrifying weather condition is known as the perfect storm, and that day it was beginning to unleash its fury upon these climbers at the top, freezing flesh within minutes. Of course, they had no idea. They were too overjoyed and distracted by their victory. Meanwhile, the 3 climbers who stayed at the higher camp for some extra rest also decided to continue their climb towards the summit, even though the weather was getting worse rapidly. One way or another, they also got to the top. But when they eventually reached the top, the weather conditions had deteriorated to a point where everything was covered in white and they couldn't see anything except for each other. At first, the 4 who already got to the top were nowhere near to be seen, but after a short while they all got reunited. So now, all of the 7 climbers have got to the top. They achieved their goal, however things just were not too looking good. They tried to report their situation to Ascent Center. It was the headquarters of the park, but the reception was poor. Their batteries were running low and they promised to call back at 8 p.m. However, they never made that call, and the 7 men were never heard from again. They had no chance at surviving the perfect storm. What happened to them exactly is not found, but whatever happened to them, they suffered a terrible fate. On the morning of 18th of July, there was a distinct cloud formation over the summit. This cloud indicated that 2 weather systems were violently colliding. Warm, moist air was clashing with cold, stable air. Considering how the team on the summit had no shelter or any means to build one because they had abandoned their shovels, they must have been completely at the mercy of the storm. With only 1 sleeping bag for every 2 men, they had no protection from the strong wind. They couldn't light a stove, melt snow for water, or cook food. So in other words, they were just completely doomed. On the other hand, the storm had been also pounding the remaining at the lower camp at 15,000 feet for 2 days. But it's reached its peak intensity on July 21st. It was impossible to stand outside the tents, and the strong wind made it difficult to breathe, causing a feeling of suffocation. On July 20th, 3 climbers at the lower camp decided to return to the high camp to search for their missing teammates. However, the storm had covered their trail markers with a foot of snow, making travel slow and dangerous. They eventually had to turn back. There was no way they could just climb now. Joe Wilcox, the one who organized this adventure, was among the 5 at the lower camp, and he contacted Ascent Visitor Center and informed them that 7 of their teammates were missing. The Rescue Coordination Center at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage was notified, and they requested a high-altitude flyover to drop fuel and radio equipment at the high camp, as well as batteries at the lower camp located at 15,000 feet. Meanwhile, another expedition led by the experienced members of the Alaska Rescue Group and the Bill Babcock's MCA expeditions was taking place on another different part of the mountain. They had been notified about the Wilcox team, and by this point, they also suspected that this team of kids must be in trouble, as they were aware that the summit winds exceeded 100 miles per hour. Babcock's team had constructed snow walls around their tents and even built an igloo, anticipating that they hadn't experienced the worst of the storm yet. As the winds continued to grow stronger, reaching approximately 80 miles per hour, which was higher than the force of a hurricane, the Alaska Rescue Group searched for a plane that could handle such high winds. Unfortunately, they couldn't find one suitable for the task. All while, Joe and the other 4 climbers at the lower camp were cramped inside a 4-person tent. They couldn't even find enough space to operate the stove, so they relied on their own body heat to melt the snow in the water bottles for drinking. They could only eat non-cooked food like candy and crackers. Despite still suffering from altitude sickness, they contacted Ellison Visitor Center through radio and informed them that they planned to descend the mountain in the morning. According to Andy Hall, the author of the book Denali's Howl, aka the superintendent of Mount McKinley National Park at the time, the wind outside was incredibly loud, resembling the sound of a jet engine. It brought strong gusts that could be heard with thunderous roars. Although the sky cleared in the morning, the powerful winds continued, causing a ground blizzard. By the following morning, they began the descent, but they felt hopeless though. Exhaustion, hunger, thirst, and just crippling fear they were feeling were unbearable. But somehow, they got to the steepest part of the descent. There, they saw the best thing they had seen in days. They spotted the tents of Bill Babcock's expedition, who came to their rescue. Babcock's team provided them with food and water. Meanwhile, the other 7 men had been quiet for almost a week, and the mountain remained covered in dense clouds, making it impossible for any rescue efforts by foot or aircraft. Andy Hall describes the storm as the most severe one to ever hit the mountain, especially when people were actually on it. Nevertheless, the Babcock MCA team actually decided to climb to the summit to help the 7 stranded climbers when the weather got a bit bearable. As a rescue team, they couldn't just leave a bunch of kids on the summit to die, or at least they wanted to recover the dead bodies. Don't know how, but they did ascend to the summit, and there, when they approached the camp, there was no sign of movement, no calls of relief, and no survivors. The scene was filled with an eerie silence. But they did find 3 corpses of the 7 young climbers. Yeah, by that point, it was too late. In fact, one of the 3 corpses frightened and shocked the rescue team so much that they didn't even take photos for later identification of the deceased man. This corpse was one of the climbers sitting upright beside a makeshift tent. Babcock described the man's face and hands as blue, green, white, frozen, and showing signs of decomposition. It appeared that the man had been blown over by the strong winds during the storm. He had held onto a pole, but the tent likely ripped apart and his sleeping bag was blown away. So, tragically, he froze to death while holding onto the pole. The exposed hand of the deceased climber had turned black, indicating that it had been subject to freezing and thawing multiple times. The other 2 corpses had suffered similar fates but found on different spots of the summit. Besides these 3 bodies they found, Babcock came across a sleeping bag near a crevasse, and inside it he found a pair of wool socks. This led him to believe that someone had met a tragic end at the bottom of the crevasse. So that may be the clue or evidence of what might have happened to the 4th corpse. The remaining 3 corpses, well, they were nowhere to be found. All this made Babcock and his team realize that death is always a looming possibility for those who are careless or unlucky on Denali. The Babcock Expedition that day only discovered 3 bodies, like I said, and they realized that there was no hope for rescuing the remaining climbers from the Wilcox party. So out of the 12 men, only 5 survived. The tragic fates of the deceased members were likely unavoidable. Considering the kind of weather conditions they were in, coupled with little to no experience they had in conquering a mountain as big as Denali, they stood no chance at all. Andy Hall describes the storm the men experienced as a rare and extraordinary event, perhaps occurring only once in a lifetime or even once in a century. Even with modern technology, there's little that can be done when such a massive storm strikes. The wind on the mountain had reached record speeds before, but this time it was the most severe. Along with the strong west winds, there was also air moving through narrow passes called gap flow, which could have made the wind even faster, potentially reaching speeds of 300 miles per hour. That day, Joe and his team had unfortunate timing, being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Even the remaining 5 members survived by luck. Their decisions were random with little to no planning whatsoever. Solely because they came across Babcock's team, they did not die, fortunately. However, one thing I find interesting and even a bit more mysterious about this whole incident is that why all 7 corpses were not found at the same spot on the summit. It's almost like all 7 members have run towards 7 different directions for some reason before they died. Hell, one even might have fallen into a deep crevasse, according to Babcock. Just let me know what you guys think. Alright guys, that's the end of this story. I hope you guys enjoyed and also learned something from this tragedy. Until next time, stay safe out there and goodbye.